Hello, I am Stacy Schiller. I'm a teacher at Raritan High School in Hazlitt. I teach U.S. history, sociology, and an elective on the Holocaust. This is me here on the left-hand side. I'm at in a Me Too exhibit at Monmouth University, I believe from last winter, it looks like, since I'm bundled up in a coat and a scarf. I also do some work in Holocaust education with other educators, and this is a picture of me at Change. I'm here on the bottom in the pink pants, working with other educators to explore best ways to teach the Holocaust. I've been working with Change for a number of years, and they supported the program that I did with a Holocaust organization out of New York. I also identify as an anti-racist educator. I have been an actively anti-racist, doing anti-racist work for at least 12 years. I try to be an ally to people of color. As a white ally, I believe that racism exists, and I believe that we can't pretend that it doesn't. And we're going to start from this premise today for this presentation. I'm going to give you some information about that, but I'm not really going to try to convince you. We're going to start from this fact that racism still exists. I do this anti-racist work in part for my family. You can see me right here with my husband, my cousin and her husband. This is my brother, and my other cousin and her wife. And I especially do it for these babies, my cousin's two children, and my sister-in-law and brother-in-law, my niece and nephew right here. And I want to live in a world without racism. I want to live in a world that celebrates all of these beautiful biracial children for who they are in their entirety, for all parts of who they are. I want to acknowledge also before we start that I speak as a white woman and I speak mostly to other white folks. I want to say to the people of color who may be watching this presentation, I may not be able to teach you or share with you anything that is new to your experiences, but I do hope that you will listen and that you'll feel supported to know that white folks are speaking out and not ignoring racism. So what are we going to do today? The title of this presentation is The Dilemma of Being Colorblind, and Can We and Should We Pretend Not to See Race? This has originally been designed as a very interactive presentation. I love to do questions and answers as I go along and present with the student groups at the colloquium. I've been doing this for a number of years, and my favorite part, of course, is hearing from the students and hearing your ideas and engaging with you. I also, as my students in high school can tell you, really don't love to talk the entire time. And so I've incorporated some videos that give us some things to think about, and I will comment on them, of course. But I will miss this year that interaction with students, which I've been missing with my own students for a number of months. But what we're going to do today is we're going to look at and challenge this ideology of colorblindness as an individual way to look at race. I'm going to argue that we should not be colorblind and that we have to start, as I said, that even though a whole lot of people don't consider themselves to be racist, we do live in a world where racism exists in a systemic way. Okay, so we're going to start from this premise. I want to share with you just a few statistics so that you can keep in mind where we're coming from and what we're basing this presentation on. We'll start right here with healthcare. And I want to share with you that the infant mortality rate for babies of Black women is over 2 times the rate of babies for white women. That's from the U.S. Center for Disease Control and Prevention from last August. I want to share with you that a 2012 study found that the majority of doctors have unconscious racial biases when it comes to their Black patients. They're not purposely being racist, but the study found that Black Americans are far more likely than whites to have access to to lack access, to emergency medical care. The hospitals they tend to go to are less well funded. And even Black doctors face discrimination. They're less likely than their similarly credentialed white peers to receive government grants for research projects. As far as economics go, this chart and the information that I have to share with you talks about both income and wealth. So just really quickly, a difference between income and wealth. Income is the amount of money that you make, your take-home pay, the checks you receive, your paycheck that you receive for your work. And the differences in income is that Asian folks make about $87,000 a year. White non-Latino Hispanics are at about $70,000, about $17,000 less. Latino individuals are at almost $20,000 less than that, $51,000 and a little bit more. And Black folks' average income is $41,000. So there's a great gap between Asians at the top and Black folks at the bottom. The gap in wealth is even greater. Wealth is the amount of money, not that you get in your paycheck, but that you have in savings and investment. And wealth is important for a number of reasons, mostly because in a situation like we're in right now, for example, if you have wealth, it's something you can fall back on if you happen to be out of work. So white families, medium white family wealth income is about $147,000. And this means that that's the money that, again, they have in the bank or investments, including something like their homes, that they own their own homes and can sell their homes for more than what they owe or what they paid for it. The median Black family has just 2% of that number of white folks, about $3,500. So again, white folks are at 147 and Black folks are at 3,500. Latinos are a little bit better at 4% of that wealth and 6,500. And Blacks and Latinos are 2 times more likely to have no wealth at all than white folks are. Looking really quickly at criminal justice issues, Black folks make up about 13% of the population, but they are 40% of the prison population. Studies show that if a Black person and a white person each commit a crime, the Black person has a better chance of being arrested. Once arrested, Black folks are convicted more often than whites. And when they're convicted, they're about 20% more likely to be sentenced to jail time, and their sentences tend to be about 20% longer. Statistics also show that Black drivers are about 30% more likely to be pulled over by the police. Okay. And finally, education. We know that public schools in the US are becoming more and more racially segregated. If you thought that preschool, at least, was a racism-free zone, well, Black children make up about 18% of preschoolers nationwide, but they're about 50% of all suspensions. That seems like a strange thing to me, that preschoolers are being suspended, but that's what the studies have indicated. When all age groups are examined, not just preschoolers, Black students are 3 times more likely to be suspended than white students, even when they have similar types of infractions. Okay. Let's take a minute to look a little bit deeper at systemic racism. We are going to look at a video that is going to give us one example. We know that this is not true for everyone, but I think that it gives us an idea of sort of this big picture of racism a lot better than me just spending a couple minutes like I just did, giving you all of those numbers. So I have linked to the presentations. I am hoping that we're not going to have to watch ads. I apologize if we do. I will go through them as quickly as we possibly can.
This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin, who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names. Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment, even among college graduates today. You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is work towards becoming more aware of your own implicit biases. What are some prejudices that you might hold that you're not aware of? Second, let's acknowledge that the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow laws are still affecting access to opportunity today. As a result, we should support systemic changes that create more equal opportunities for everyone. Increasing public school funding and making it independent from property taxes would be a great start, so that poor and wealthy districts can receive equal access to resources. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Luckily, we're all part of the system, which means that we all have a role to play in making it better. Peace. This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy.
We need to watch it again. The first time was good. And I do really like that because it talks about the system and then this idea that we do have an individual role to play. And it mentions that, again, even if folks don't identify as racist, that we may have implicit bias. This presentation is not about implicit bias, but Harvard has a really interesting implicit bias program where you can go to their site and you can take the test to see if you have a preference for one racial group or another. And there are a couple of different, it's really interesting. There are a couple of different ways that they look at that. So that's something that's important to think about. Yes, this is a system. And individuals are part of that system, and that means that individuals can change that system. There's certainly no easy solutions, but acknowledging race is going to be our first step to do that. Before we get to the idea of colorblindness, I want to just mention one other idea, take one other look at systemic racism that's happening right now. I think I would be remiss to not talk about the unequal impact of the coronavirus on communities of color. Right here in New Jersey, our Department of Health, I'm not sure if you have seen, New Jersey has a COVID-19 dashboard that lets us know what's happening, and they have demographics that talk about, as soon as it loads up, wait, I think I have it open here. No, of course not. Here it is. That mention the COVID deaths by race and ethnicity. So white non-Hispanics are 52% of COVID deaths, but I looked up, they are 72% of the population. White folks are 72% of the population in New Jersey, but only 52% of the deaths. Black folks are 15% of the population. And let's see if we can do this. No, hang on. Mouse pointer. Let's try this. No, it doesn't want to do it. Okay. Black folks are 15% of the population, but almost 20% of the COVID deaths. Latino folks are about 20% of the population, a little bit less percent of the deaths, and Asian folks are 10% of the population, but only 5% of the deaths. So we see that discrepancy right here in New Jersey. The CDC also talks about how there's an overrepresentation of Blacks among hospitalized patients. And they give a couple of reasons for that. One is that members of racial and ethnic minorities may be more likely to live in densely population areas where social distancing is a lot more difficult. The work circumstances might be different, and we see that here in this graphic, that fewer than 1 in 5 Black workers and fewer than 1 in 6 Latino workers are able to work remotely. That means that if they want to go to their jobs, if they can go to their jobs, they're out there on the front line. Nearly a quarter of employed Black and Latino workers are employed in the service industry. And Latino workers are 53% of agricultural workers. And so their risk of infection is higher because they have to go to work. They can't work from home like many of us can. They also tend to work in jobs that don't have sick leave. So even when they're not feeling well, they might be going out into the workforce. And if your resistance is down, you may be more likely to get sick. And then finally, another reason, Latinos are almost 3 times as likely, and African Americans almost twice as likely to not have access to health care. And so all of these are factors in this disproportionate impact of the virus on these particular communities. So we have established the systemic racism that exists. And there's lots of things that we can do to fight systemic racism, including organizing with like-minded individuals and bringing more attention to these issues. But we first need to consider how we look at race. And so we are going to watch a video. Now, the video comes from a Harvard Business Review, and it's a study that gives us some insight into the comfort level of people in mentioning race. So we'll start to take a look at being colorblind and see how folks are comfortable talking about it. I'd like you to watch the video. If you are with someone, when he asks you to stop the video, you can do that and play with a partner if you have someone. If not, just keep watching. There's some really good information to hear, and we'll go over that afterwards.
I'm Michael Norton. I'm an associate professor at Harvard Business School and the co-author of the new book, Happy Money, The Science of Smarter Spending. I want to talk to you today about a piece that we have in the July-August issue of Harvard Business Review. But before I tell you what's in that piece, I first want to ask you to play a game with me. You're looking at an array of faces right now, and I'm going to ask you to play a version of the game that you may have played as a little kid that was called Guess Who. And if you remember that game, you and a partner both had faces in front of you, One of you had a face, and the other person had to guess the face you were looking at from that array of faces. I want you to play this game with me right now. Grab a partner and pick a face that your partner is going to have to guess. And the only rule is your partner can only ask you questions that you can answer with the words yes or no. Pause this video and take a few minutes to play the game. When you're done playing the game, come back, hit unpause, and I'll tell you more about the research that we've conducted. So you finished the game. How did it go? What kinds of questions did your partner ask you? Maybe they asked, is this person smiling or not? Or is this person wearing a hat or not? Or maybe they asked a question like, is this person black or not? But if they did, that would be quite unusual because in the research that we've done, we find people are very, very reluctant to ask about race when we have them play the exact game that you just played. Why are people reluctant? It appears as though they feel that by asking about race, it might signal that they care a lot about race, and it might even signal that they might be a racist. We find in our experiments that even though the array was half white and half black, and asking the question, is the person white or black, a very useful tool for narrowing down the faces, people are really, really reluctant to ask about that question. And in fact, in another version of the game, we find that if we have people play with a black partner, they become even more unlikely to ask about race because they're even more worried that they might appear to be biased when they do that. And there's an even worse outcome because people who avoid asking about race, even though they are trying to do so to look as though they don't care about race, end up looking more uncomfortable and more biased. I think the dynamics in this game, which you and your partner just experienced, really suggest how complicated and interesting the dynamics are when we talk about race in contemporary America. We also tried some different versions of this game. In one of them, we actually asked not grown-ups to play the game, but for children to play what is, in the end, a children's game. We wondered when we had them play the game you just played whether the same thing might happen. What we found is that older children, by the time they were 9 or 10, actually stopped asking about race in the game. They'd already learned that maybe it's not wise to ask about race. But the kids who were younger, who were 7 and 8, who weren't so concerned about those social norms yet, in fact, were more likely to ask about race. And as a result, they ended up beating the older kids, performing better on the game. We tried one other version of the game. We ran a version of the game that's very much like the one you played again, but with one difference. In this case, all of the faces were white, but each picture had, in the lower corner of the picture, a white or a black dot. And we wanted to see if it's not about race, if it's not about is this person white or black, but more is this dot white or black, if now people would be very willing to use color because it could be so useful for guessing the face. And that is exactly what we see as well. So if it's race, people will not ask the question black or white, but if it's the color of a dot, like the color of paint on a wall, people are perfectly happy to ask about white or black. And it really suggests that it's the social dynamics surrounding race that make us so uncomfortable talking about color. We know in everyday life, people often struggle to describe someone in the workplace who may be of a different ethnicity. And while the motivation comes from a good place, which is I don't want to be or appear racist, it ends up impeding communication. And organizations that are savvy realize that a good solution to race is not to avoid talking about race, which, as you saw when you played the game, can impede communication between people, but actually acknowledge race openly. One of the things that we see when we talk to companies that are forward-looking in this space is they're being open and honest about racial differences between workers and among workers. Thanks for taking time to play our game. You can learn more about this research in the piece that Evan Applebaum and I wrote, which will appear in the July-August issue of Harvard Business Review. I'm Michael Norton, Associate Professor at Harvard Business School and co-author of the book Happy Money, The Science of Smarter Spending.
Okay. So an interesting, let's go back and talk about this a little bit. A lot of interesting information. I want to make a note first about the video and something that I thought about when he was discussing the players and their partners. And I noticed that he didn't identify the race of the players. He talked about their partners, whether they were playing with white or black partners, but he didn't say what race those initial players were. And I thought that that was really interesting and maybe a little complicated. Was he assuming that those original players were white and the white folks were playing with white folks or playing with black folks? I just wanted to point that out because I think that they missed an opportunity to go even a little bit deeper. And perhaps we're starting from the premise that we would assume that those players were white. So I thought that that was pretty interesting. So some of the results of the study really do show that the social dynamics about race make people uncomfortable talking about color. The black dot versus the white dot was used right away, but that adults, especially if they're white adults, I'm assuming, playing with black partners, don't mention race. We've been taught not to talk about it. I've read a lot about folks who, black folks who have overheard someone in the grocery store, a little child, asking about their race and being told, shh, don't talk about that. And in a lot of cases, white children are taught not to acknowledge race. I believe that I was taught not to acknowledge race through my teachers, through my family. We see people as people. And for lots of reasons, I think that that is problematic. So this was really interesting study that the Harvard Business Review did. They, of course, are looking at the implications in the workplace, and they're saying that workplaces that have open discussions about race are probably going to be more comfortable places for everybody to work. So this discomfort with race, particularly for white people, leads a lot of people to try to ignore it, right? And that makes people seem more racist. Well, what is this colorblindness ideology about? It's an ideology that really comes from after the civil rights movement. White people didn't want to talk about race anymore. It was no longer socially acceptable to openly discriminate or to use racist language. And so people, white folks, wanted to get past race. It's based on the belief that the successes of the civil rights movement, of which there were many, have removed all racial barriers to success, that race doesn't matter to anyone at all. And that if we talk about race, that's where the problem lies. The civil rights movement did, of course, have a lot of successes, but as we saw earlier in the presentation, there's still a lot of disparity between white folks and folks of other races in the United States. Young people in particular like this theory because they believe, many of them, that racism is a problem for older generations. Oh, it was my grandparents who didn't like to work with Black people, or didn't like Latinos, or were upset that the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and so hated all Asians. But that's simply not true. That it's not only a problem for the older generations, and it is not just going to soon die out. Lots of people think that being colorblind is a good thing, that we make society better by not seeing race or ethnicity. But to talk a little bit more about young people, particularly college-age students, I just want to turn to a study by Brendisha Tynes, who's a professor of educational psychology and African American studies at the University of Illinois. She says that if you subscribe to a colorblind racial ideology, I'm quoting her here, you don't think that race or racism exists or that it should exist. You're more likely to think that people who talk about race and racism are the ones who perpetuate it. And you think that racial problems are just isolated incidents that people need to get over and move on. She was awarded about 10 years ago a $1.4 million grant to study the effects of online racial discrimination. She got that grant from the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. And so she did a study about images from racially themed parties on the internet, on social media. And she looked at people who identified as colorblind and how they felt about those images. What she found was that people who reported higher racial colorblind attitudes were more likely to be white, and they were more likely to be okay with these racially themed party images. What I mean by that is maybe a themed party where you are supposed to dress like a Mexican, or a Hawaiian themed party like a luau. 58% of African Americans were unequivocally bothered by the images. Only 21% of whites were. And folks who identified as low in racial colorblindness were much more to be vocal in expressing their displeasure and opposition to those images, which tells us that in general, white folks are more likely to be colorblind than people of color. That is, of course, not true for everyone. It's just a generalization, but certainly an important thing to take a look at as we discuss this, continue to discuss this issue. Okay. So, colorblindness as an ideology. There we go. We know that white folks are more likely to be colorblind because many times, as the Harvard study showed us, they're afraid of appearing racist and they don't want to be racist. That comes from a really good place, right? But this colorblindness ideology also assumes that we have a choice whether to see color or not. Is it even possible to ignore race? Babies tell us that it's not realistic and that we actually have to work hard to ignore race. And there was I believe it was a Time magazine article many years ago, Is Your Baby Racist? And an NPR did a story about 8 or 9 years ago about whether or not babies see race. And there was a study done with music, happy music and sad music. Infants between 6 and 9 months looked at faces of their own races longer with happy music. So they, after listening to happy music, they looked at faces of their own race longer than faces of other races. But when they listened to sad music, they looked at faces of other races more. Okay? There was no real analysis as to why that happened. But a second study done about a woman looking at the corner of a TV screen. And they found that infants between 6 and 8 months were more likely to follow the adult's line of sight if she was of their own race. It tells us that we're more likely to learn from adults of our own race than adults of other races. And the idea here is that bias comes not from negative experiences, but from a lack of experience, which I think is a really interesting point. Sometimes people choose not to talk about race, like in the Harvard study, they're uncomfortable with it. But sometimes people have not had experiences with race, and that leads them to not talk about it. So if you think about someone who may have grown up in a really diverse community and truly feels that they don't see race because everybody was friends and everyone played together and it didn't matter, they may propose to be colorblind because they truly feel that they've had those experiences. But again, I have to start from this premise where we can't address systemic racism if we individually choose not to see it. So that brings us to seeing race, right? We're going to watch one more quick video. Actually, it's not the last one, but one more quick video. Do blind people see race? And I want you to consider, what do you think? What do you think you're going to see here about blind people and race? Let's hope we don't have to sit through a commercial. Let's see.
So, you're blind. You must not be racist, right?
I am racist.
My name is Jacob Kamaunu, and I am a restaurateur.
My name is Mike Mello, and I have light perception, so I can tell like if the lights are on or the studio lights are on, but I can't like see anything else.
I can't see anything, no lights, no color, anything. Totally dark.
Are you racist?
No.
Are you racist?
No. I would like to think that I'm not. However, there are those stereotypes that have been instilled in everyone.
I am racist because I think every white person is racist. I participate in institutions, like I benefit from capitalism, which was built on slavery and racism.
I've experienced racism, but I don't let it bother me. I think allowing it to affect me gives them the upper hand.
Are you racist?
No,
Why?
because I can't see.
Blindness does sometimes take those racial cues out of society, because if I can't tell by someone's voice or accent or whatever, like I have no idea.
I've noticed with a lot of people I meet, I don't really find out what their race is until a while after we meet.
We don't necessarily go around asking, "Oh, are you black? Are you white?" You are who you are, as far as I'm concerned.
I work with a person who's Japanese, but I would have no idea unless she told me. Like, there's just no like cue that I have.
I can tell more or less if the person's Caucasian, Black, Mexican, whatever it might be, by their voice, accent.
Like seeing someone's skin color, I think, is not the only way that we differentiate people's culture or race.
I can pick up dialects and sometimes try to associate them with what race they might be. I wish I could just completely ignore it, but I can't help it. If I'm walking down the street and I hear a couple of people and they're aggressively talking to each other, and it's slang and vulgar speech and it's not eloquent, I naturally sometimes think, oh, those people might be Black because of their accent. I shouldn't think like that, but there are natural stereotypes out there in the world.
Can you tell someone's race by their voice?
No.
What do you think my race is?
I don't know. I don't know.
You could hear the way someone speaks and make a determination about them that could be completely inaccurate because you just don't know.
I've had experiences where I've known, a person for probably a year and a half or so, and they never knew I was Black. Ironically, this was another Black person. It was like, you're Black? And I was, yeah, I'm Black. So
I believe there's racism within the blind community because there's racism everywhere, and the blind community is no exception.
I think it's their upbringing, how they were raised.
I grew up in North Idaho, and I wasn't exposed to a lot of people from different cultures. And I grew up in a home with my dad, who was pretty racist in the term I want to use, but pretty vocal about identifying people by their race. It's just how he grew up.
I'm from India, and my dad, he's a different complexion, and they got married each other, and they're pretty, happy couple. It's a good example for us,
Have you ever experienced racism within the blind community?
If I did, I probably didn't recognize it because I don't look for it.
The issues I've seen the blind community kind of take on, maybe they tend to be more white issues. One thing I haven't seen the blind community collectively work on is housing justice. And I'm complicit in this too, right? Because I'm a blind person, right? So I could be the person to organize, and I'm not.
People who are blind come in all shapes, sizes, economic backgrounds, beliefs, and some of them are racist. That's something that we, as a society in general, blindness excluded, need to work on being better at.
Okay, so I thought that was really interesting. Again, going back, really interesting video. One of the things I really like about it is that it shows that the variety of experiences and perspectives within the blind community. Just like people in different racial groups have a variety of experiences, see race in different ways, so do people within the blind community. And it reinforces the idea that people see racism on different levels. Some people see it individually, but others, like the woman in blue, says that she's racist because there's a racial system in this country that privileges white people over people of color, and she knows herself to be white. You can also see that there was some discomfort. The man whose picture is here seemed to be a little uncomfortable describing, overhearing a conversation. And I thought that the way that he explained that was he was rethinking maybe a little bit of how he wanted to say what he was saying. And I saw some of that discomfort with him. But this also tells us that race is not just about skin color, that there are other cues that folks use to determine race that some people are aware of and some people aren't. Accent, voice, tone. There may be some other senses that folks are using. Hair texture, perhaps, if there's physical interactions between people. So I think that this was a really great way for us to think about seeing race and acknowledging race and what the difference is between them, right? So maybe you're sitting here thinking, okay, but I really just want everyone to get along. And, we're all the same on the inside. So, I don't want to deal with this. And that is certainly a valid position. This is hard to talk about. This would probably be the most interactive part of my presentation, where I would share with you some quotes about race, and we would determine whether or not they are pro-colorblind, that they want race to be ignored, or they're anti-colorblind, that they want race to be recognized so that we can deal with it. But probably the most famous of all of those quotes that people think go both of those ways, anti and pro, would be Dr. King's quote. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will be judged by the color of their, I'm going to start that one over. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And many people take this to believe that Dr. King was promoting a colorblind ideology, that he doesn't want his children to be seen as Black kids. He just wants them to be seen as children. I disagree. Knowing what I know about Dr. King and the work that he did until he was assassinated, I don't think he thought that we should stop seeing race and that we should become colorblind. I think that he meant that we should make it so that race doesn't determine our place in the world. Race doesn't determine how people see who we are and judge us, but who we are, the content of our character, determines that. And from the work that he has done, and the readings, the letters that he has written, the speeches that he has given, I truly believe that he's asking us to look race square in the face. That he's not telling us to be colorblind, but that we should talk about race, that we should deal with race, and that we should see race. So I have shared with Change the quotes that I use for this activity. Teachers may want to take some time now or at the end of the presentation to look at those and go over those with their students. I think that there are some really powerful quotes, and we're going to hear a video in a few minutes from someone who has a particularly anti-colorblind, wanting race to be recognized position. Okay, so what's wrong with colorblindness? We've been talking about this ideology. Why is it a bad thing? Well, part of it is that it ignores someone's identity. Think about how you might feel if someone ignored a really important part of you. Maybe race isn't important to you, but maybe there's something else about you, about your identity, whether it is your religion or your gender, or your sexual orientation, or your, did I say religion? Maybe that's really important to you and you don't want people to ignore it. I know that I grew up where at a time where it was impolite to ask people about their disabilities. If someone was in a wheelchair, you ignored it. You didn't talk about it. And now we're at a time where I see my students, if there's a student at school in a wheelchair, there's lots of great interaction with that student and kids will talk to them about it, but they won't make it the only thing about it. I want to take a look at this quick clip about from a student, DaVinci Lucas, who's talking about the idea of being colorblind.
I don't want a colorblind America. I want an America where your race or ethnicity isn't the sole determinant of what you can do or how people will judge you or whatever. I don't want someone to look at me and say, oh, I didn't recognize that you were Black. I want because Blackness is a part of me and I want them to see all of me.
Okay. I think that last line is the most powerful and maybe the most convincing thing for me. This idea that your race is part of who you are and you want to be seen for all of who you are. Okay. I'm trying to make this full screen. I also think colorblindness is a poor choice of ideology because it's a lie. We see race, even blind people recognize race, babies recognize race, and race has meaning in our society, right? Individually, it has meaning to folks who find their race to be a really important part of who they are. But as we saw in the beginning with systemic racism, it does have meaning in society. Racism is a social value we assign to people, and actions are, in many cases, even if folks don't do it on purpose, we sometimes act differently towards people of different races. Okay. Being colorblind hides the actual experiences of racism that people encounter because of their race. That when people want to talk about it, if we say we're colorblind, sometimes we tell people that's not, oh, that's not important, that didn't actually happen to you, and it can demean people. It also implies that being a member of a particular race is shameful. We're going to ignore that. You shouldn't talk about it. And this implication is that you should be embarrassed to talk about race. We should be ignoring it and not paying attention. That can be really hurtful to people. Okay, so what do I do? Well, we need to acknowledge that racism exists and that some people are privileged because of their race. Now, that does not mean that all white people are privileged. Poor white folks struggle with a lack of privilege in their lives, but they don't do it because of their race. They do it, they struggle because they are poor. So many of our identities sometimes impact how much privilege we have. That's a whole other presentation that we could do, but just consider that that yes, not all white people have a lot of privilege, but it's not, they don't lack privilege because of their race. We can don't pretend not to see race, right? What do I do? I'm going to acknowledge that race exists. Okay. I'm going to, my husband and I talk about race almost every day. You don't have to do that, but not being colorblind is a great place to start. Break the silence and speak up. When you see racial injustice, when you see disparities, speak up, ask questions. Listen to people of color when they say they're experiencing racism. Validate their experiences, support them by asking what you can do. But don't rely on people of color, if you're somebody who's white, to teach you all about racism. You need to do the work yourself and maybe find some resources to learn more about the history of racism in this country and what's happening right now. Take personal responsibility to learn more about the experiences of someone of a different race. Again, don't just rely on other folks to teach you. It's up to you to learn more. And you can also protest against racial injustice, okay? Organize with like-minded folks. Continue to have these discussions. And the anti-racist group that I was in was actually just white people. And we talked about the ways that racism impacts our lives and the ways that we could support people of color. One example of something that you can do is to consider Halloween. This was a program, I believe, out of the University of Ohio. We're a culture, not a costume. And kind of going back to that study about the online racially themed parties that folks were having, this ties into that by sort of promoting that, yes, it's fine to wear a costume on Halloween, but it shouldn't be from someone else's culture. That these are stereotypes, and that stereotypes, while being part of the story, are only a single story, or only might be partially true, but are not only true. And they're certainly not something that we want to promote. A really interesting video that I love to talk about and show is a TED Talk by Chimamanda Adichie. She's an author who talks about the danger of the single story. And these images and these stereotypes are the single story. They are only one part of this culture. And using this as a fun costume is not okay. It's not okay with people from these cultures, and it's not okay in general. So that's one thing that teenagers can and young people can do is to consider your Halloween costumes. Okay? You need to know this. You need to know that it's okay to be uncomfortable talking about race, and that an honest attempt at discussing race is much better than simply ignoring it and not challenging yourself to learn and grow. The only way that we can make change in our communities is to talk about what needs to be changed. All right. And so I'm going to leave you with a spoken word poem by a woman named Alexis Henry. She wrote and is performing this poem called Colorblind.
Colorblind. Descriptively, I am a color. Does your color blindness mean that you can't see me? That I'm an acceptable kind of invisible? Or is whiteness so priceless that your mind's eye has had to bleach me to compel you to treat me equally? In your mind, blind ceases to be a malady, a disruption of normative behavior that just swings every discussion of injustice in your favor, because we can't discuss what you can't see. So, are you telling me that if I just see myself as white or disappear, everything would be fine? Because I am a color. I'm brown like Mississippi mud. I'm the shade of tree barks and bamboo shoots. I'm the color designers choose when they want their stuff to look natural. I say we dark like the dirt God used to make Adam. And while we're on the subject of creation, this color was carefully selected by God for my formation. And though it has always had to survive repeated attempts of extermination, and though it has always been under attack, black has always been beautiful and rich and worthy of your sight. So I apologize if I offend you. But I don't apologize for my position. You see, I'm of a pleasant disposition and I love everybody. I'm just not interested in climbing ivory tower fallacies of technicolor dreams of unachieved equality. I'm just not interested.
I just wanted to end with a thank you. Thank you for listening to this presentation. Thank you for joining me in the fight to challenge racism, to reflect on your own thoughts and experiences with race. I wish you good luck and safety and good health at this time. And thank you again.